Camel controversy collapse. A sun-scorched excavation trench cuts sharply through compacted desert soil, where centuries of wind and sand have sealed away the past. Until a careful brushstroke clears the dust from a long, curved bone that is instantly recognizable. Not pottery, not a weapon, but something far more controversial. It is a camel bone, buried beneath archaeological layers dated centuries earlier than it was ever supposed to exist. For decades, critics insisted this animal was the Bible's fatal flaw. It's an undeniable anachronism, proving the patriarchs were legendary inventions rather than historical figures. But this bone does not belong here unless the critics were wrong. So the question is unavoidable and explosive. What happens when the camel argument collapses? The camera lingers on the exposed earth as sunlight catches the edges of the bone, emphasizing that this discovery is not theoretical, but tactile. It's not speculative, but physical, because what lies in this trench represents the collision of long-held academic certainty with material reality. Where a single artifact has the power to destabilize decades of confident skepticism by existing exactly where it was never supposed to be. To ensure full transparency, please note that this video uses AI-generated visuals to bring history to life. Faith and facts, where evidence meets scripture. Our thesis for generations. Skeptics confidently asserted that the Bible committed a clear historical error by describing camels during the time of Abraham, arguing that these animals were not domesticated in the Near East until nearly 1,000 years later, long after the patriarchal age had supposedly passed into legend. From this assumption flowed a devastating conclusion. If Genesis mentions camels too early, then Genesis itself must be a late fictional composition projecting familiar animals backward into imagined history. Yet this argument did not unravel through philosophical debate or theological rebuttal. Instead, it quietly collapsed under the weight of physical evidence. As zooarchaeology bones, measurements, and biological stress markers began to expose a far more complex reality buried beneath the desert sands. And in the final third of this video, we will reveal the single excavation detail that critics almost never mention, a detail so disruptive that it explains why the camel argument has all but vanished from modern skeptical discourse. This silence is not accidental, because once a claim built on absence encounters physical remains that refuse to fit the narrative, the conversation shifts from confident dismissal to quiet avoidance, making the disappearance of the camel argument itself a form of evidence, one that raises questions not only about camels, but about how quickly certainty can dissolve when the ground begins to contradict the lecture hall. The skeptic's claim. The skeptical claim appeared straightforward and compelling, especially when repeated often enough to sound authoritative. According to this narrative, camels were not domesticated anywhere in the ancient Near East until roughly 1000 BC. Yet the book of Genesis repeatedly describes camels functioning as pack animals, trade assets, and visible indicators of wealth during the lifetime of Abraham, who is traditionally dated to the early 2nd millennium BC. To critics, this chronological mismatch seemed decisive, offering what they believed was clear proof of retrojection, in which later writers supposedly inserted animals familiar to their own era into stories set in a distant and imaginary past. The argument was widely circulated, reinforced in textbooks, echoed in university lectures, and confidently repeated in documentaries, until it came to be treated as settled fact rather than a working hypothesis. The camel argument, skeptics claimed, was open and shut. What remained largely unexamined, however, was the foundation of that confidence. Because the argument rested not on positive zooarchaeological evidence, but almost entirely on the assumption that the absence of early camel remains constituted proof that domestication had not yet occurred. And then the ground began to speak. This moment marks a turning point in the discussion. Because history is not ultimately decided by repetition or authority, but by evidence recovered from the past itself. And when assumptions hardened into dogma encounter new data emerging from controlled excavation, the burden of proof quietly shifts back onto those who once claimed the case was closed. At a desert excavation site in the southern Levant, archaeologists uncovered camel bones, embedded within clearly stratified occupational layers that had been independently dated 2 centuries earlier than the supposed domestication window. These were not artistic depictions or ambiguous literary references, but actual skeletal remains, metatarsals, vertebrae, and jaw fragments that displayed unmistakable signs of repetitive load-bearing stress consistent with animals used regularly for transport. Under microscopic examination, the joints revealed pathological wear patterns that do not occur in wild camels, but emerge only when animals are repeatedly burdened with heavy loads under human control. This was not interpretation, it was physiology. Such stress markers function as biological records, preserving within the bone itself a history of use, movement, and labor. And because these markers develop gradually over time, they provide direct insight into the lived relationship between humans and animals, offering evidence that is remarkably resistant to reinterpretation or ideological filtering. Core evidence. To understand the weight of this evidence, one must picture the excavation itself, where the desert floor consists of hardened sphanced clay layered with centuries of human activity, each stratum revealing ash lenses, collapsed mud brick walls, and discarded tools that testify to long-forgotten lives. From within these layers, the camel bones emerge, a metatarsal nearly 40 centimeters in length, its surface yellowed by age and subtly pitted, not from decay, but from chronic mechanical stress accumulated over years of repeated labor. Nearby, a vertebra shows abnormal thickening at the joint surfaces, a biological response to sustained load-bearing pressure that transforms bone structure over time. These are not the remains of hunted animals processed for meat, but of animals worked, guided, and relied upon. Zooarchaeologists carefully measure and catalog each fragment, comparing bone density and morphology against known, wild, and domesticated camel populations, where the match becomes unmistakable. These animals lived under human control. Equally critical is the dating. Charcoal recovered from the same layers undergoes radiocarbon testing, while ceramic typology independently confirms the chronological framework, placing these remains firmly within the Middle Bronze Age, the very period traditionally associated with the patriarchal narratives. This evidence aligns with a frequently overlooked reality. Domestication is not a sudden invention, but a gradual process that begins quietly, regionally, and selectively, long before animals become widespread or commonplace. And remarkably, this is precisely how Genesis portrays camels. When viewed together, the physical dimensions of the bones, the biological stress indicators, and the securely dated archaeological context form a converging line of evidence that resists dismissal, because each element independently supports the same conclusion. These camels were present, managed, and utilized during a period long assumed to predate their existence, reshaping the historical landscape in which the biblical narratives are set. Contextual proof. In Genesis, camels appear in specific and limited contexts, consistently associated with long-distance trade, travel across harsh terrain, and the accumulation of wealth rather than everyday agricultural life. They are never portrayed as ubiquitous farm animals or symbols of mass transportation, but as valuable assets owned by elite households engaged in regional exchange networks. This narrative restraint is striking because it mirrors exactly what early-stage domestication would look like archaeologically. In Genesis 12, 24, and 30, camels appear alongside gold, servants, and extended journeys, reinforcing their role as rare, high-value animals rather than common livestock, a portrayal that fits the archaeological data with remarkable precision. This is not careless storytelling. It is contextual realism. And here, the tone must shift, because the issue is no longer camels alone, it is credibility. The biblical authors possessed an accurate understanding of animal use that modern scholars denied for decades. Then the accusation of ignorance collapses under its own weight. So the question becomes unavoidable. If this is true, what does it mean for your understanding of Genesis? if physical evidence now confirms what the text quietly assumed? Then the problem was never the Bible's claims, but the confidence with which they were dismissed. The camel argument did not fade because it was successfully debated away. It faded because zooarchaeology stopped supporting it. The dirt itself betrayed the skeptics. This shift forces a reassessment not only of one specific objection, but of a broader pattern in which ancient texts are judged prematurely by modern assumptions. Because when archaeological data repeatedly converges with restrained biblical descriptions, it raises the possibility that these texts preserve authentic historical memory rather than imaginative reconstruction. Conclusion. And now we arrive at the detail critics rarely acknowledge. One excavation did not merely uncover an isolated early camel bone, but revealed multiple generations of domesticated camels within the same occupational sequence, indicating sustained human use rather than accidental presence. This was not an anomaly, it was a pattern. Which means camel domestication was neither a late invention nor a fictional projection backward in time, but a developing reality exactly where Genesis places it. The camel argument did not collapse in a debate hall or lecture theater. It collapsed in an excavation trench, quietly, decisively, and permanently. To ensure full transparency, please note that this video uses AI-generated visuals to bring history to life. If you found the evidence in this deep dive compelling, know this: the mission of Faith and Facts is to systematically dismantle skepticism by demonstrating that the Bible is the most archaeologically confirmed book in human history. To explore the full scope of this evidence, make sure you watch our full-length documentary compilation, Abraham, Journey to the Unknown Land, Archaeology, Memory, and the Birth of Biblical History, where these discoveries are woven together into a unified case. If you want to support this work, please hit the like button, subscribe for weekly evidence updates, and share this video with one skeptic you know. Because sometimes all it takes to challenge an argument that once seemed unassailable is a single bone pulled from the ground. What remains is not a sensational victory, but a sober reminder that history often corrects certainty in silence. And that when material evidence aligns with ancient testimony, it invites viewers not merely to reconsider a single argument, but to re-examine the assumptions that shaped their confidence in the first place.